Once a Federation enforcer, Asher Kain thought he'd seen it all. But when his squad was turned to ash by a weapon they couldn't even name, the hunt for redemption became his new life. Now, a bounty hunter in the desolate Shattered Verge, he's after the most wanted fugitive in the galaxy. Mira Veyl, the last of the Lumari, with powers that defy reason and a price tag big enough to bury the past. But the truth behind her mission? A galactic weapon capable of destroying entire worlds. And it's more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. What if the past, and the weapon that destroyed his world, isn't over yet? Asher's about to find out, and the galaxy will never be the same. Want more? Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and stay tuned for the next chapter in the hunt. Asher Kain wasn't cut out for heroics. Once, he'd been a Federation enforcer. Ruthless, precise, the kind of man who'd storm a dreadnought with a vibroblade and a flicker of defiance in his eyes. That was before the Nexus collapse, before the Federation turned his squad into ash to test a weapon they wouldn't even name. Now, he was a bounty hunter, a lone figure carving his path through the void aboard the Stellar Wraith, a frigate patched together from scrap and spite. Its hull bore scars like metals, its engines growled with reluctance. But it was his, a refuge from a galaxy that had chewed him up and spat him out. The Shattered Verge stretched beyond the viewport, a desolate sprawl of fractured moons and fading stars, a place where the Federation's grip weakened to a whisper. Most saw it as a graveyard of hope. Asher saw it as the only freedom he had left. His latest contract pulsed on the holo display. Mira Veyl, wanted for theft, sabotage, and treason. The payout? 10 million credits, enough to claim a quiet rock somewhere and bury the past. The hitch? She'd hit the FSS Dominion, the Federation's pride, a warship that could crack planets with a single volley. The dossier was thin. Mira Veyl, last of the Lumari, a species the Federation claimed extinct. Whispers of strange abilities, eyes that shifted like nebulae, a mind that could bend thoughts, followed her name. Asher smirked, flicking through the redacted lines. Dead race, huh? You've got a hell of a way of proving them wrong. He tapped coordinates into the console, setting a course for Drinker 9, a festering planetoid at the Verge's core where the desperate thrived and laws dissolved into dust. 3 days later, the Stellar Wraith pierced Drinker 9's orbit, its thrusters spitting blue flame as Asher wrestled it through a turbulent descent. No pristine landing pads here, just craters and swirling ash. He guided the ship into a ravine held by the Crimson Talon, a syndicate tied to him by an old debt sealed in blood. A dockmaster slithered forward, scales glinting like rusted steel, its voice a guttural rasp. 700 credits, human. Asher transferred the payment, his hand resting on his pistol's grip. Touch my ship, and you'll regret it. The creature's jagged maw split in a sneer, but it backed off. Drinker 9's capital sprawled below, a jagged wound of twisted spires and flickering hollow signs, cloaked in a crimson fog that stung the lungs. Asher pulled his cloak tight, the air heavy with the stench of burnt circuits and despair. Mira was holed up in the Midnight Spire, a den for the Verge's elite. Reaching it meant cutting through the gutter maze, a warren where every shadow hid a threat. He moved with purpose, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, the crowd parting as if sensing a predator in their midst. The Midnight Spire rose ahead, its facade a cascade of liquid shadow that rippled under the dim light of twin moons. A towering sentry, for talons gleaming like knives, blocked the entrance. Private club, scum. Beat it. Asher slid a cred chip forward, voice low and edged. Mira Veyl. Tell her Asher Kain's calling. The sentry's compound eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease, maybe, before it stepped aside with a grunt. Inside, the air thrummed with alien melodies, a blend of drones and chimes, laced with the tang of spiced liquor. Asher scanned the chamber, his gaze cutting through the haze of patrons, smugglers, warlords, thieves, until it landed on her. She sat in a recessed alcove, half shrouded by shadow. Mira Veyl, her eyes, blazing amber one moment, shifting to a deep violet the next, snapped to his, and a jolt ran through him, sharp and unbidden, like she'd brushed his mind with invisible fingers. Her lips parted in a slow, deliberate curve, a smile that promised trouble, and every nerve in his body tensed, urging him to turn back. He didn't. He crossed the floor, each step deliberate, the crowd's murmurs fading under the weight of her stare. She lounged against the booth's edge, one arm draped casually, a glass of glowing liquid resting near her hand. Her dress clung to her, streaked with the dust of the verge, but she wore it like armor. Asher stopped at the table's edge, keeping his distance, his hand twitching toward his pistol. "Room for one more?" he asked, voice rough but steady, eyes locked on hers. Mira tilted her head, her gaze sliding over him like a blade testing its mark. "I was wondering when you'd show, Asher Kain," she said, her tone smooth yet laced with a challenge. She leaned forward slightly, the motion subtle but enough to pull his attention, and a flicker of heat stirred in his gut. He clenched his jaw, holding his ground. "You've got my name," he said, resting his forearms on the table, the leather of his coat creaking faintly. "Save me the trouble. 10 million credits, says you're mine to deliver. What did you swipe from the Dominion?" Her laugh was a low ripple, sharp and untamed, cutting through the chamber's hum. She lifted the glass, sipping slowly, then set it down with a faint clink. "I didn't swipe," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I took back what they had no right to hold." Her fingers brushed the glass's edge, a slow sweep that tugged at his focus, but he forced his eyes back to hers. "Enough riddles," he said, leaning in, his tone hardening. "What was it?" Her expression shifted, the playful glint fading to something colder, her eyes narrowing as they held his. "A piece of their doom," she said, her words precise, icy. "A key they'd kill entire worlds to reclaim." Asher opened his mouth to push further, but the air thickened, a faint hum building in his ears. Something was coming. He could feel it, a storm about to break. Mira's gaze flickered past him, her posture tensing, and he knew the hunt had just taken a turn he couldn't yet see. Asher Kain felt the air in the midnight spire shift, a subtle pressure building behind his ears as Mira Veyl's words hung between them. A key they'd kill entire worlds to reclaim. Her eyes, now a deep violet, narrowed with a cold intensity that pinned him in place, but something else stirred in the chamber, a hum, low and ominous, like a storm coiling to strike. He started to press her further, his lips parting with a demand, when the world erupted. The spire's entrance shattered inward, a deafening blast that hurled shards of obsidian through the air like black rain. 6 figures in matte black armor stormed through the breach, their rifles humming with charged energy. Mercenaries, not Federation, their movements raw and predatory. The crowd scattered, screams cutting through the alien melodies, but Asher's focus snapped tight. "Down!" he barked, lunging across the table. He crashed into Mira, his arms wrapping around her as they hit the floor, his body shielding hers from the chaos. Her warmth pressed against him, sharp and sudden, and his hand grazed her side, fingers brushing the curve above her hip, a fleeting spark that jolted through him. She tensed, then softened, her breath hot against his neck as plasma bolts tore through the booth, splintering it into smoking ruin. "Your friends?" she murmured, her voice steady despite the gunfire, her lips close enough to graze his ear. "Thought they might be yours," he growled, his hand tightening briefly on her hip before he shifted, peering over the wreckage. He drew his pistol, the weight grounding him, and fired twice. 2 mercs dropped, their armor sparking. Mira's hand clamped his forearm, her grip firm, nails biting into his skin with a sting that shot up his arm. "This way," she hissed, pulling him toward a hidden panel in the wall. Asher followed, his fingers catching her elbow as they slipped through, the contact a quick anchor in the madness. The passage beyond was a tight maze of rusted pipes and dim conduits, the air thick with dust and oil. The sounds of pursuit, shouts, charging weapons, followed them, muffled but relentless. "Who are they?" Asher demanded, keeping pace as they darted through the twists, his shoulder brushing hers in the narrow space. "The ones after what I took," she shot back, her tone clipped, urgent. "Keep moving, they won't stop." She navigated the turns with a sureness that spoke of familiarity, leading them deeper into Drinker Nine's underbelly. "What did you take?" he pressed, his hand steadying her as she ducked a low beam, his palm brushing her upper arm, her heat seeping through, a quiet pulse against his fingers. She glanced at him, her eyes flashing jade in the flickering light. "A piece of their endgame," she said, her voice low and fierce. "A trigger they'd kill for." The tunnel split ahead, and she pointed left without hesitation. "There are loops to the alleys. We can lose them." Asher trusted her call, following as the walls closed in, his coat snagging on jagged metal. The mercs' voices grew louder, a barked order echoing through. He spun, firing a bolt back into the dark. It flared, clipping a pursuer's shoulder, slowing him, but the others pressed on. "They're gaining," he muttered, turning back to her. "Then slow them," she said, stopping abruptly. She pressed her hands to the wall, eyes fluttering shut, and the ground quaked, a tremor swelling into a violent shudder, dust raining down. Shouts of confusion broke out behind them as the mercs stumbled. "Telepathy," she breathed, her voice tight with strain, a bead of sweat tracing her cheek. "Go!" Asher seized her arm, his fingers wrapping around her bicep, her warmth bleeding through as he hauled her forward. She matched his stride, and they burst into an alley shrouded in Drinker Nine's crimson fog, the air biting with ash and sulfur. His cloak's filter kicked in, clearing his lungs, while Mira slipped on a breather mask pulled from her dress, the seal hissing softly. "Your ship," she said, stepping close, her chest brushing his as she tilted her head up, her eyes piercing through the mask's lens. "Where?" Her nearness sent a restless heat coiling in his gut. "Why should?" "Because we're dead otherwise," she cut in, her hand pressing flat against his chest, a firm spark igniting where her palm met his skin. 10 million's dust if they catch us." Her gaze held him, unyielding. Asher exhaled hard, the air hissing through his teeth. "Ravine Delta 3, he said, voice rough. "But we're trapped without a way out." Her lips curved faintly beneath the mask. "I've got the way," she said, easing back but letting her fingers linger, tracing a quick line across his sternum before dropping away. She pointed to a gap between two crumbling walls. "There, move." He followed, his hand settling on her lower back to guide her through the fog, his palm pressing into the subtle arch above her hips, a quiet fire flaring under his touch. She didn't pull away, her pace syncing with his as the stellar wraith emerged ahead, its hull a lifeline in the haze. Bolts seared the ground behind them, the mercs closing in. "Faster!" Asher snapped, shoving her toward the ramp as he punched in the access code, pistol still in hand. The mechanism clanked open, and Mira scrambled aboard, vanishing into the hold. Asher leapt after her, a bolt grazing the hull as he slammed the hatch shut, the clang echoing sharply. He bolted to the cockpit, dropping into the pilot's seat and slamming the controls. The engines roared, the ship lurching upward as the ravine blurred below. Mercs swarmed the site, their weapons flaring uselessly as the stellar wraith tore through the atmosphere, turbulence rattling the frame. Asher pushed the thrusters hard, breaking into the void silence, Drinker Nine shrinking to a dull ember behind them. Only then did he ease back, adrenaline still buzzing in his veins. He engaged the autopilot, the cockpit settling into a low hum, then turned to Mira. She stood at the threshold, mask off, arms crossed with a mix of defiance and calm. Her dress was smudged with grime, and her eyes, now a deep indigo, met his with an intensity that shrank the space between them. Asher leveled his pistol at her, not to fire but to hold the line. "Talk," he said, his voice steady, roughened by the chase. "What's this key, and why's it worth this hell?" Mira stepped closer, unfazed, her movements fluid and deliberate. She stopped just beyond the barrel, her presence pressing against him like a live current. "Sit down, Asher Kain," she said, her tones softening but edged with iron. "You've just walked into a war you can't outrun, and I'm the only one who can show you the stakes." Asher kept the pistol steady, her words sinking deep, stirring the ghosts of the Nexus collapse. The hunt had been a job, 10 million credits for a target. Now, with her standing there, fierce and unshaken, it was a battlefield, and a part of him burned to step onto it with her. The stellar wraith hummed through the void, its engines settling into a steady drone as the shattered verge swallowed Drinker 9's fading ember behind them. Asher Kain sat in the pilot's chair, pistol still leveled at Mira Veyl's chest, the cockpit's dim light casting sharp shadows across his face. His pulse still thrummed from the chase, but his voice was cold, unyielding. "Talk," he said again, the word a command, roughened by the fight. "What's this key, and why is it worth turning us into targets?" Mira stood at the cockpit's edge, arms crossed, her stance a blend of defiance and calm that made the small space feel tighter. Her dress bore the scars of their escape, smudged with grime, torn at the hem, but she wore it like a badge. Her eyes, now a deep indigo, met his without flinching, and she stepped closer, ignoring the weapon's threat. "You want answers, Asher Kain?" she said, her tone low, threaded with steel. "Then lower that gun. You're not shooting me. Not yet." He held her gaze, the weight of her words tugging at something buried deep. The Nexus collapse, the betrayal, the fire. Slowly, he eased the pistol down, resting it on his thigh, but his fingers stayed near the trigger. "Fine," he said, leaning back slightly, the chair creaking under him. "Start with the key." She exhaled, a faint sound that softened the air between them, and slid into the co-pilot's seat, her movements fluid despite the tension. "It's not just the key," she began, her voice steady but edged with something raw. "It's the heart of Project Erebus, a weapon the Federation built to burn worlds from the inside out. They've been testing it for years, wiping out anyone who won't bend." She paused, her eyes shifting to a molten amber, locking with his. "Like my people, like yours." Asher's jaw tightened, the name Erebus striking a nerve he'd long tried to deaden. "Erebus is a rumor," he said, his voice flat, testing her. "Federation called it propaganda, said it was just scare tactics. Rumors don't leave craters," she shot back, leaning forward, her knee brushing his thigh, a fleeting contact that sent a shiver up his spine. "It's real, and that key's the only thing keeping it dormant. I took it from the Dominion before they could use it again." Her gaze bore into him, unyielding, daring him to deny it. He didn't flinch, but the memory of Nexus gnawed at him. His squad screams, the unnatural heat, the orders that made no sense until it was too late. "Where's it now?" he asked, his tone hardening as he pushed the ghost back. "Hidden," she said, tapping her temple with a faint smirk. "Somewhere they'll never look." She leaned back, breaking the contact, but the air still crackled with her nearness. "They'll kill me to find it, and you, now that you're with me." "Why tell me?" he snapped, shifting in his seat, his hand tightening on the pistol's grip. "Why not twist my head with that telepathy trick and be done with it?" Her smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something softer. "Regret, maybe." "Because you're not just a hunter," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Nexus wasn't an accident, was it? They've burned your team to test Erebus, same as they've burned my world. You've got as much reason to hate them as I do." The words hit like a punch, ripping open scars he'd buried under years of blood and dust. "What do you know about Nexus?" he growled, leaning forward now, his free hand brushing her wrist as he gripped the console between them. Her skin warm, her pulse a faint thrum under his fingers. "Enough," she said, not pulling away, her eyes holding his with a fierce clarity. "General Cade ran the op. He's the one hunting me now, hunting us to finish what he started." Before Asher could process that name, Cade, the bastard who'd signed his squad's death warrant, a shrill alarm cut through the cockpit. Proximity sensors flared red on the console, 3 signatures dropping from warp behind them. Asher spun to the controls, his hand slipping from her wrist as he punched up the display. "Chips," he muttered, voice tight. "Fast movas unmacht." "Death hand," Mira said, her tone icing over as she slid to the weapons console, her fingers flying across the panel. "Cade's personal dogs." She glanced at him, her eyes jade now, sharp with focus. "They don't negotiate." Asher cursed under his breath, banking the stellar wraith hard toward a pulsar field flickering in the distance. "Strap in," he ordered, his hand brushing her shoulder as he reached to steady her. A quick, firm touch that sent a jolt through his palm. She nodded, buckling in without a word, her calm unshaken as the ship shuddered under the maneuver. The chase ignited fast. Plasma raked the shields, the pursuers weaving through the void with lethal precision. Asher dove into the pulsar's edge, the field's radiation scrambling their sensors, while Mira took the guns, her aim deadly. 2 blasts, and one ship erupted in a silent fireball. "Nice shot," he grunted, pulling a tight spiral to dodge a volley. "Keep us alive, and I'll keep shooting," she replied, her voice steady, her fingers brushing his arm as she adjusted her aim, a fleeting heat that lingered in his nerves. He cut power, letting the ship drift in the pulsar's noise, then powered back up as Mira lit up the second ship, its hull crumpling into debris. Asher swung the stellar wraith wide, catching the third in a crossfire, and it broke off, vanishing into warp. The cockpit fell silent, save for the hum of the systems and the faint crackle of the pulsar outside. Asher leaned back, exhaling hard, his hands still gripping the controls. He turned to Mira, her eyes now a deep indigo again, watching him with a mix of wariness and something else. "Trust, maybe. Not bad," he said, his voice rough but grudgingly impressed. "You're welcome," she murmured, her lips curving faintly, her gaze lingering on his a beat too long. She shifted in her seat, her knee brushing his again, and the air thickened, charged with an unspoken pull. Asher's hand twitched, tempted to reach for her, but he pulled back, forcing his focus to the viewport. "We're not out of this yet," he said, his tone clipped, shoving the heat down. "Cade's not the type to quit." "Neither am I," she replied, her voice soft but unyielding, a promise that echoed in the dark. Asher didn't respond, but her words settled in him, heavy and alive. The hunt had shifted. 10 million credits was a footnote now. This was about survival, revenge, and something he couldn't name yet, burning between them in the silence of the void. The stellar wraith drifted through the pulsar field's eerie glow, its shields flickering under the radiation's relentless pulse. Asher Kain gripped the controls, the cockpit's silence heavy after their narrow escape from Cade's Death Hand squad. Mira Veyl sat beside him, her presence a quiet storm, arms crossed, eyes a deep indigo, watching the void with a stillness that belied the chaos they'd just survived. The air between them crackled, unspoken words piling up like debris in a gravity well. But Asher kept his focus on the ship's diagnostics, the screen flashing warnings he couldn't ignore. "Shields are at 30%, he said, his voice rough, breaking the quiet. "Engines took a hit back there, overheating fast. We're not outrunning anyone like this." He glanced at her, expecting a quip, but she only nodded, her gaze shifting to the console. "Then we fix it," she said, unbuckling and standing, her tone firm but calm. "Show me the damage." Asher led her to the engine bay, a cramped chamber of humming machinery and tangled conduits, the air thick with the tang of scorched metal. He knelt by the main drive, pulling a panel free to reveal a mess of fried circuits, plasma burns streaking the casing. "Here," he muttered, hands already moving with a wrench. "Coolant lines ruptured, needs a bypass." Mira crouched beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she studied the wreckage. "I can reroute it," she said, reaching for a tool, her fingers grazing his wrist, a quick, warm jolt that made him pause. She didn't pull back, her focus on the task, and Asher forced his attention to the repair, their hands working in sync. The space was tight, forcing them closer, her breath a faint rhythm against his ear as they patched the line, the tension between them simmering beneath the surface. Days bled together in the void, the repairs dragging as the stellar wraith limped through the verge. Mira pushed boundaries, her voice sharp with teasing jabs, her presence a constant pull. Once, as she handed him a power cell, her fingers lingered on his palm, her touch a slow burn that made his grip tighten, heat rising in his chest. "Focus," he growled, turning away to slot the cell in, but her low laugh followed him, a sound that coiled around his nerves. The console blared again, course deviation. Asher stormed to the cockpit, finding Mira at the controls, her hands rerouting them toward the Valthor verge, a hostile zone beyond Federation reach. "Are you insane?" he snapped, grabbing her wrist to pull her from the chair. Her pulse raced under his fingers, a wild beat that echoed in his own veins. "Perfect hiding spot," she said, unflinching, her body pressing against his in the struggle, her warmth a spark that flared through him. "They won't risk war with the Valthor." He pinned her wrists with grav cuffs, his hands brushing the soft curve of her forearms as he secured them. A fleeting pressure that made her breath hitch, her eyes locking with his, now a blazing amber. "You don't call the shots," he said, voice rough, releasing her and canceling the course. "Veyl rift, it'll mask us better." She smirked, wrist-bound but unshaken. "Fair enough." The rift's currents were treacherous, a swirling void of gas and debris, but Mira's calm voice guided him through, her insights cutting through the chaos. "Starborn trick?" he asked, glancing at her as the ship steadied. "Survival," she replied, her gaze softening as it traced a scar on his neck. Old implants from his Federation days. "They didn't take those out, huh?" Her hand brushed his shoulder, a light touch that lingered, sending a shiver down his spine. "No choice," he said, his voice low, her fingers a quiet weight he didn't shake off. Trouble struck fast. Valthor cruisers materialized, their sensors piercing the rift's haze. Asher dove into a vortex, the ship groaning under the strain, Mira's voice's anchor as turbulence rocked them. A shard of debris punched through the hull, grazing her side, and she hissed, clutching the wound. He pulled her to the med bay, his hand sliding to her ribs to steady her. Her skin warm beneath the torn fabric, her gasp soft as his fingers pressed gently, a spark igniting where they met. "Hold still," he muttered, patching her up, his touch lingering a beat too long as their eyes locked in the dim light. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice a thread of heat, her hand brushing his as he pulled away. A signal flickered, a strange ship, crystalline and sleek, hailing them with an offer of sanctuary. "Lummery," Asher guessed, watching her reaction. "Home," she breathed, a flicker of longing in her eyes, now jade again. They followed, docking at a shimmering refuge hidden in the rift, its towers glowing like captured stars. The Lummery Council greeted Mira as kin, eyeing Asher with suspicion, but she vouched for him, her hand grazing his in a quiet promise as they stepped into the unknown. That night, alone in a chamber of translucent walls, the tension broke. Asher turned to her, the air thick with days of unspoken need. "Why me?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice rough with restraint. "Because you fight like I do," she said, her eyes blazing amber, meeting his advance. He pressed her against the wall, his lips crashing into hers, fierce, hungry, a collision of pent-up fire. His hands roamed, tracing her waist, then higher, fingers brushing the soft swell beneath her dress, her breath catching in a low moan swallowed by the kiss. She arched into him, their bodies melding, a storm of light and shadow igniting. The room trembled as their edges blurred, a supernova flaring in the dark. Stars collided, galaxies spun, and the void itself seemed to pulse with their union, a dance of fire and gravity veiled in cosmic haze. When it faded, they stood tangled, breathless, the silence heavy with what they'd forged. "Where now?" she murmured, nestled against him, her voice a soft echo. "Anywhere," he said, a grin tugging at his lips. "As long as it's us." The stellar wraith waited, a battered witness to their reckoning, ready to carry them deeper into the verge and whatever war lay ahead. The Lumary refuge shimmered in the Veyl rift, its crystalline spires piercing the void like captured light. Asher Kain stood at the edge of the council chamber, the translucent floor reflecting the swirl of stars beyond. Mira Veyl faced the Lumary elders, 7 figures draped in robes that shimmered like liquid metal, their voices a low hum as they greeted her as kin. Her eyes, now a steady jade, flicked to Asher, a silent acknowledgement as she vouched for him. "He's with me," she said, her tone firm, cutting through their wary murmurs. "We're here to end this." The council's leader, an elder with eyes like twin moons, inclined their head. "The Federation's weapon, Erebus, threatens us all. If you have the key, Mira Veyl, what's your plan?" She stepped forward, hands clasped behind her. "We take it to the Unity Spire," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Cade's addressing the galactic conclave there in 3 days, broadcasting to every system. We get in, override the feed, and show them what Erebus really is. The truth will break him." Asher crossed his arms, the weight of his pistol at his hip as steady comfort. "Bold," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Spire's a fortress. Cade's got it locked tight. How do we even get close?" Mira turned to him, her gaze sharp. "We don't go as ourselves," she said. "The Lumary have tech, disguises, forged credentials. We blend in, slip through the cracks." She paused, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You're good at breaking things, aren't you?" He matched her smirk with a grim nod. "Damn right. Prep consumed the next 2 days, relentless, precise." The Lumary outfitted them with holomasks, shifting Asher's scarred features into a bland Federation officer's face, his gray eyes dulled to brown. Mira's disguise muted her presence, her eyes fixed as hazel, her posture stiff to match a low-ranking aide. The Stellar Wraith stayed docked, its repairs completed by Lumary engineers, while Asher and Mira drilled their cover, codes, protocols, every detail of the Spire's layout burned into their minds. The night before departure, they stood in the ship's hold, the silence heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "If this goes south," Asher said, checking his pistol's charge, "we're not walking out." Mira met his gaze, her eyes breaking through the disguise for a moment, amber, fierce. "Then we don't let it go south," she replied, her voice unyielding. "Cade doesn't get to win." The Unity Spire loomed in Federation space, a towering needle of steel and glass orbiting a blue dwarf star, its corridors buzzing with diplomats and guards. Asher and Mira slipped in with a delegation, their forged IDs passing scrutiny as they moved through security. His jaw tight, her steps measured. The main chamber was a cavernous dome, packed for Cade's speech, holoscreens amplifying his every word to the galaxy. They split at the control wing, Asher to the data core, Mira to the broadcast hub. He navigated the maze of conduits, disabling patrols with quick, silent strikes, each move a testament to years of instinct honed in blood. A guard rounded a corner, and Asher dropped him with a single blow, dragging the body into shadow. The core's terminal glowed ahead, and he hacked in, planting the override Mira needed, his fingers steady despite the ticking clock. Mira reached the broadcast hub, her forged clearance buying her a fleeting window as she slipped past a distracted technician. The chamber thrummed with the hum of machinery, holoscreens flickering with diagnostics, but her focus locked on the central console, a sleek tower pulsing with the heartbeat of the Spire's comms network. Beyond the reinforced glass, the main chamber loomed, packed with delegates as General Cade's voice boomed through the galactic conclave, his speech live-streamed to every system in the galaxy. "The Federation stands as your shield," he declared, his tone dripping with false assurance. "A bastion against chaos." Asher's voice crackled through her comm, cores set, overrides in place. "You've got 3 minutes before his speech ends and the feed cuts." His words were tight, urgent, the weight of their plan hanging on a razor's edge. Mira's pulse kicked hard as she slid the data shard into the console's port, her fingers steady despite the countdown ticking in her mind. 3 minutes, she muttered, sinking the shard. "Plenty of time." The system resisted, security protocols flaring red, but she bypassed them with a Lumary cipher, her hands a blur. Alarms shrieked. Cade's forces had sniffed them out, boots pounding closer. "Asher, they're coming, get here now." He burst into the hub seconds later, pistol raised, as Death Hand operatives stormed through the entrance. 6 shadows in black armor, rifles spitting energy. Asher dove behind a terminal, returning fire, 2 bolts catching a merc square in the chest, dropping him in a shower of sparks. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice raw as he rolled to new cover, drawing their attention. Mira's screen flared green. The shard was live, but the clock showed 90 seconds left. Cade's voice droned on, oblivious. "We bring order where others falter." She slammed the override command, the system fighting her every keystroke, sweat beading on her brow. A bolt grazed her shoulder, searing the air, and she ducked, cursing under her breath. "Come on," she hissed, forcing the final sequence. Asher tackled a merc, closing on her, slamming him into the wall with a crack of armor against steel. "Now, Mira," he roared, grappling another as the timer hit 30 seconds. The chamber trembled as the broadcast feed buckled. Cade's face flickered, then vanished, replaced by the shard's truth. The screens flared, Erebus unveiled. Schematics of a planet killer, test logs detailing eradicated systems, footage of burning worlds rolling across the galaxy's eyes. Nexus flickered into view, a jagged wound of fire and ash, followed by Lumary's shattered ruins, the screams of the lost echoing in silence. Cade's voice faltered mid-sentence, his composure cracking as the conclave chamber erupted in gasps and shouts, delegates recoiling from the monster in their midst. Mira stood over the console, her eyes blazing indigo, the shard glowing in her hand like a captured star. "For my people," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, steady despite the chaos. "For yours." Across the galaxy, the reaction ignited. System hubs flared with outrage, encrypted channels buzzing as colonies and fleets turned on the Federation's lies. Holofeeds captured the unraveling, riots sparking on core worlds, admirals issuing stand-down orders, allied races severing ties in real time. The Conclave's Lumary allies surged forward, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation, demanding Cade's head. Guards breached the hub's doors, weapons trained, but the broadcast was done, Cade's reckoning sealed in the galaxy's fury. Asher hauled himself up, blood streaking his arm from a graze, and charged Cade as the general lunged for an escape hatch. "Not this time," Asher growled, slamming him to the ground, a knee pinning his chest. Cade's eyes widened, recognition flashing through his snarl. "Voss, you're dead for this." "You first," Asher spat, wrenching Cade's arms behind him and shoving him toward the Lumary envoys storming in, their robes billowing like storm clouds. "Take him," he said, his tone ice-cold. "He's finished." The chamber descended into pandemonium, shouts, weapons clashing, delegates scrambling as the galaxy's verdict rained down. Mira stepped to Asher's side, the data shard dimming in her grip, her breath steadying as the chaos faded around them. "We did it," she said, her voice softening, a rare crack in her steel resolve piercing through. Asher nodded, the weight of Nexus lifting, not gone, but lighter, a scar dulled by justice. "Yeah," he said, meeting her gaze, her eyes still indigo, fierce and unbroken. "We did." The spire's lights dimmed, the structure trembling as the galaxy shifted under the truth they'd unleashed. Federation fleets recalled, Cade's empire of control fracturing into dust. The Lumary envoys secured the hub, their forces moving to detain Cade's loyalists. But for Asher and Mira, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The war they'd sparked had only begun, and the Verge waited, a battlefield ready for their next move. The Unity Spire's chamber pulsed with chaos as Cade's empire crumbled, the air thick with shouts and the clatter of retreating guards. Asher Kain stood over the fallen general, his breath steadying as Lumary envoys dragged Cade away, his snarls drowned by the rising tide of the Conclave's fury. Mira Veyl stood beside him, the data shard in her hand now dark, its purpose fulfilled. Her eyes, a deep indigo, met his with a quiet strength, the weight of their victory settling between them like a shared shield. The holoscreen still flickered, broadcasting the galaxy's upheaval, core worlds igniting with protests, Federation fleets grounding under mutiny, allied systems pledging support to the Lumeri and their kin. The truth of Erebus had fractured the Federation's iron grip, its lies exposed in a wave that rippled beyond the verge, beyond even the stars they'd torched. The conclave chamber buzzed as delegates rallied, their voices merging into a chorus of reckoning, but Asher and Mira remained still, anchors in the storm. A Lumeri elder approached, their robes shimmering like molten silver. "You've given us a chance," they said, their voice a low hum of gratitude. "The key is safe now. Erebus will never rise again. Stay with us, Mira Veyl. Rebuild what was lost." She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "My people need a future, not a past," she said, her tone resolute. "I've fought too long to sit still now." Her gaze flicked to Asher, a silent question hanging there. He felt it too, the pull of the fight, the fire that had forged them through blood and dust. A Federation officer in a crisp uniform stepped forward, his insignia gleaming despite the chaos. "Kain," he said, voice clipped but respectful. "The mutineers want you back. Reinstate your rank. Lead what's left of the fleet. You've proven what a human can do." Asher's jaw tightened, the offer stirring old ghosts. Nexus, his squad, the life he'd lost. He glanced at Mira, then back to the officer. "I'm done taking orders," he said, his voice rough but firm. "The verge is where I belong." The officer nodded, stepping back, and the elder inclined their head in understanding. The chamber's din faded as the galaxy reshaped itself, but for Asher and Mira, the path was clear. They turned as one, threading through the crowd to the docks where the stellar wraith waited, its battered hull a testament to every battle they'd survived. Aboard, Asher punched in the autopilot, the ship's engines humming to life as Mira settled into the co-pilot's seat. The viewport framed the spire shrinking behind them, its lights a dying ember against the void. "Offers like that don't come twice," she said, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. "You sure about this?" He leaned back, a grin breaking through the scars of his past. "Never been surer," he said, meeting her gaze, her eyes now a warm amber, reflecting the starlight ahead. "The verge is ours now, no Federation, no Cade, just us and whatever's out there." She nodded, a spark of defiance lighting her expression. "Good," she said, her tone carrying the weight of their shared fight. "I'd hate to take it on alone." The stellar wraith leapt to warp, a streak of defiance cutting through the shattered verge, its fractured moons and dying stars giving way to uncharted black. Offers of power and refuge lay behind them, rejected for a freedom they'd carved with their own hands. Asher's grit, Mira's resolve, a bond forged in fire that no galaxy could break. The void stretched wide, a canvas of possibility, and they faced it together, not as hunter and prey, not as soldier and fugitive, but as equals unbound. The war was won, Erebus buried, Cade a memory crushed under the weight of truth. Ahead lay new battles, new worlds, but for now, the silence of the stars was enough, a victory as vast as the universe itself, and theirs to claim.